computer. Okay, we are recording. Great.
You
Well,
are.
Dr. Rhonda Butcher, thanks very much for agreeing to be my second guinea pig for these freshwater scientist interviews series I've started doing, and I'm not quite sure where they're going to go, but I appreciate that you've made the time and are willing to take the experiment.
Yep, it'll be an interesting conversation.
So look, I was looking through your CV, Rhonda, and we've known each other for a long time ago. We haven't talked a lot recently, but you know, I knew you as sort of in the early days, probably 25 years ago, maybe more, I don't know, as a wetland macroinvertebrate sort of ecologist. I think maybe you were doing a PhD, I'm not sure, but looking through your CV, I'm just going to read out a few things. So I should say to the people listening that Rhonda was a little bit reluctant to talk to me because she said, why would I want to talk to her? And when I look through this list of topics, I think, well, why haven't I talked to her about 25 years ago? So, Rhonda, you've been a consultant since you were about 2003, but and probably before that and during the time, you've worked on issues and topics associated with Ramsar wetlands and the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. More recently, a native fish management recovery strategy presumably after the fish kills in the Darling.
Yep.
You've been involved with evaluating long-term intervention monitoring and the environmental water knowledge and research programs for the TUO, Commonwealth Environmental Water Office. Is that right?
Yep.
Yep.
That's right.
The Living Murray program. You've been involved with the National Cultural Flows program. That's right.
Yep.
Wetland map.
WetMap, yeah, which is a wetland monitoring program for wetlands that receive environmental watering in Victoria.
Right.
Yep.
What have I got here? Integrated. Some sort of condition assessment programs. Integrated ecosystems condition assessment or something. Is that right?
Yeah, IECA. Yeah.
Right. and various environmental flows and watering programs overall. It's just a huge. I mean, what it sounds like. I mean, it's almost like what haven't you been involved with in the last few years? It's pretty hard to. I can't find anything too much that you haven't been involved with in freshwater.
It's been an interesting few years, so yeah.
Yeah, and busy it sounds like. But look, before we get to some of those things, perhaps I want to know. Really, go back to the beginning. Not right at the beginning, probably, but. Where did you get your interest in freshwater in the first place? Where did that come from?
It was accidental, to be honest. So
as often good things are.
Yeah, I know, and I can put it down to a single person's responsibility. I basically did or knew from high school what I wanted to do. I wanted to do biological sciences at La Trobe Uni. Mm-hmm. I took a couple of years off to work in between doing high school and my undergrad. And I worked at Melbourne Uni as a microbiology technician. And I then did my undergrad on biological sciences at La Trobe.
Right.
And in that process, I started doing volunteer work at Arthur Rylah Institute and a few other places.
Was it Parks and Wildlife or National Parks and Wildlife?
Yeah,
Fishes and Wildlife or something?
So many changes.
Yeah.
The best one's Constant Name Review.
And who were you working with back then?
That was with Peter Jackson and John Kewin. That was volunteering in the fish group. Yeah. Mounting blackfish scales for aging. Mounting blackfish.
Oh, I thought you said melting.
No, mounting them on slides and a range of things. But at the end of third year, I went to the museum and asked if they had vacation work. And one of my lecturers at La Trobe said, yes, give her a job. And that's where it all started from, basically.
Right.
I started working in terrestrial survey unit with Alan Yen, but Richard Marchant was there as well.
What year was it? What year are we talking about?
Oh, this is 1985.
Okay.
So, yeah, quite a while ago. So I did a vacation job at the museum and worked
what specifically were you working on for that?
Identifying beetles and insects, terrestrial insects from a coppicing vegetation study. So looking at just to generic level, identifying and, sorting out a collection that Alan had collected over the years.
And had you done any of that sort of?
Never, no. Okay. And I ended up having a very nerdy skill for it. So,
you need to have a particularly sort of details.
Yeah, brain, a details type person. Sort of, if you're a stamp collector, then you're going to get into taxonomy and that sort of stuff. But yeah, apparently they thought I'd get through one genus, and I got through the whole collection in the time on the vacation job. So I had a knack for it. So. So I then was going to do my honours year on terrestrial invertebrates in Nothofagus forests.
Whereabouts were these forests?
Southern Victoria and into Tassie. So, yeah. And that was going to be with Tim New. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I really wanted to have the cute and cuddly mammal experience. So I went round to a whole lot of employers and said, would you employ someone with an honours degree in entomology in mammal ecology? And they all said no. So, and then one of the people I spoke to was Ian Manser out at Arthur Rylah Institute. And he said, well, I've got a project for you. So I did radio tracking mountain pygmy possums. So I will get to the freshwater stuff.
Yeah. No, that's all right. It's good to see the pathway that you took.
Yeah. So that was my 1 year of working with the cute and cuddlies, and it was an amazing experience. So that was really cool. And then I went back to the museum. After doing honours, I rang up and said, got any work for me? And I got a job doing the Land Conservation Council Mallee survey beetle collection, identifying beetles. Right. And at that time, it was 1987, the Murray-Darling Freshwater Research Centre was just starting up, right, up in Albury.
Yep.
And Richard Marchant, who worked at the museum in the survey department, said, why don't you apply for one of these jobs? And I said, well, I don't know anything about freshwater, but I didn't know anything about beetles until I started at the museum.
So was that the people who was only Terry Hillman
Terry Hillman, Dave
Hawking?
Mitchell, John Hawking. There was about 20 staff at the most.
At that time when you
when I started. So I was one of the original technical officers. So Dave Mitchell was in charge at that time, and he gave me the job. So, but it was funny because Richard had kept the ad for the job, and I'd said, no, I don't want to move to Albury and so on. And then I finally caved in and said, yes, I'll apply for it. And he went home and got it.
Oh, really?
He kept the ad. Yeah, it was really funny. So it was Richard's doing that got me into freshwater science.
He's an influential man.
Yeah, he was. He still is. So.
Yeah, he is. It's amazing knowledge of everything that man does to the freshwater stuff.
Yeah. So I ended up in Albury with the Murray-Darling Freshwater Research Centre for about 4 years.
Okay, I need to have vague memories of. I mean, I wasn't here until 1995. So.
Yeah, I think you came you came after I left. But then we hooked up in the CRC for freshwater.
Was Paul Boone there?
Paul Boone was there. Yes, Paul was there.
Because he left just before I arrived.
Yeah. So Paul was there. Darren Baldwin, Daryl Nielsen had. I don't know if Darren had started or not. I think he had just. Maybe not. He might have done his PhD through the CRC for freshwater ecology as well.
Daryl Nielsen?
Yeah.
Yeah, he did. Yeah. That was around the time I was there, so I remember that happening. Okay, so what were you working on when you were there?
Mostly invertebrates, mostly. So working with John Hawking and Russ Shield. So I got to learn about zooplankton as well. So it was really an interesting and formative time, because it sort of opened my eyes to the whole freshwater science possibilities in terms of it being really interesting, not a lot of effort going into it at that time, all of the effort was on rivers, in terms of that being the main conduit for delivery of water.
Mm-hmm.
So wetlands really weren't even on, you know, the MDFRC did a little bit of work on wetlands. The Billabong work that Terry Hillman did, that was, and Rush Shield too, that was sort of groundbreaking back at those days.
And how was it? How was that work funded? I mean, who was funding that stuff?
Oh, I think it was pretty much through the Murray-Darling Basin Commission, I think. I'm not 100% sure because I was just the helper. I wasn't in charge of the grants or the funding aspect of it. So, but I'm pretty sure it was the Murray-Darling Basin Commission and their long-term watering monitoring programs and so on. So, John and Terry had been doing monitoring in the rivers and some of the billabongs for quite some time. So, as a water quality / condition assessment type work.
Yeah. And did you develop a particular interest in any group at that stage? Of
Beetles rock.
Yeah.
No, I really love the beetles. I think the time at the museum, I identified 13,000 beetles to species level, and it was just, it was, I don't know, I loved it. It was really good stuff. So
have you maintained that interest in beetles for?
I do, but I haven't worked on invertebrates for a long time. So I did it through my PhD. But
is it true? I've heard a quote somewhere that somebody said God must have had an inordinate fondness for beetles.
Inordinate fondness of beetles, yeah.
Is that who said that, and is it true?
Darwin said it.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a quote from Darwin. And it's one of my favourite quotes because I just love beetles.
Yeah.
Excluding microorganisms, it's true. But if you include microorganisms, not so true.
Yeah.
But yeah, they are the most diverse macro organisms. So hundreds of thousands of species. Just diversity in niches, using different ecological niches. They're just massive diversification within all the families.
Because I'm just marking some. I teach animal diversity, and I'm marking an exam at the moment. One of the questions I've got is why are arthropods so successful? Something along those lines. I've actually got the marking sheet here. And what are the five of the key reasons why there are so many arthropods?
Yeah.
Discuss this in each, of their features, and beetles is obviously one of those sort of key groups that are so diverse.
It'd probably come down to key traits too in the beetles, like they've got the hard external wings and they're a chewing mouth parts, so more flexibility across from predator to omnivore sort of range of aspects. Flight gives them the ability to take off and move around. And
what about and they seem to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, they seem to be one of those groups that are as successful as adults in aquatic systems as the larvae are. Whereas with most of them, they metamorphose and go as adults and fly off. But there's quite a few beetles that are still aquatic as adults, aren't they?
Yeah, and they're very different. Like your hemitrians or your bugs, they're the same. They look the same as juveniles and adults, but the larvae of the beetles are very different to the adults. I don't know. I just like them.
Yeah, that's fair enough. So I interrupted your chain of thought or your
that's
sequence.
all right. So basically at MDFRC I worked on invertebrate ecology, taxonomy, sort of monitoring programs, a lot of microscope work, identifying invertebrates and so on. So that was my first foray into it. And as I said, I was there for about 4 years and then moved back to Melbourne for personal reasons. I got offered, when it became sort of, I was talking to various people, Phil Suter in South Australia at the time, he's now in Albury at La Trobe, but was taking him back to the airport after one of the taxonomy workshops that we'd been running. And I was just talking in general about possibly thinking about moving on. And so he said, "Oh, are you looking for work?" And I said, "Oh, I'm thinking about it." And so I got to have an interview I was the only non-South Australian to have an interview for a job with Phil in South Australia.
Not that he was biased or anything.
No, not at all. It was the most biased interview I've ever been in, honestly, because if I forgot to say something, Phil would spill it in.
Don't tell people that. That's terrible. We like to think
it's funny at the time. It was very funny at the time. So, but then I got asked to apply for a job in Melbourne as well at the same time. So I had the interview in Melbourne on the Tuesday, then South Australia on the Wednesday. And then I found out that my dad had cancer on the Thursday. So it meant I just moved to Melbourne. So, you know, still got lots of opportunities out of that, out of a horrible situation, still ended up with some amazing opportunities. So,
I think that's testament to your personality and drive.
It's also testament to Alan Yen at the museum. So sort of 12 months after I'd moved back to Melbourne, he rang me up and said, "Are you interested in a secondment position to write a book on non-marine invertebrate conservation in Australia?" It's the first of its kind, first national assessment done. And I said, "Sure, why wouldn't you?" And so I got that job.
Can I ask you, did you think at that stage, I mean, how old were you back then?
I was 27, 28.
Did you feel it was a fairly intimidating thing to be asked to be involved with?
Yes and no, because the museum gang were very friendly, very open, and I'd already worked with them 2 to 3 times on different contracts. And Alan was such a generous boss, you know. It was always a team mentality. There was never me and you do that sort of thing. It was always, what can we do together sort of thing. So,
and back in those days, I'd like to sort of find out a little bit, I did a bit of volunteer work back in the early 80s at the Museum of the Fish section, the ichthyology section, but there wasn't a lot of sort of consulting or concerns about, it was really all about sort of taxonomy and distributions and what was that like that was for the
it was stuff? Basic survey work. So the interest for the book was around the time when biodiversity was really kicking off and those concepts. And so obviously invertebrates or arthropods are a significant component of biodiversity. So if you're talking about conservation and biodiversity, you have to talk about invertebrates. That was where the genesis of the book came from, and the push to get invertebrates recognised under threatened species legislation and things like that.
So they hadn't been up to that point?
Up until that point, no. So in Victoria, invertebrates came on. I mean, shellfish were included as fish in some legislation and so on. And so they were, you know, some of the crabs and so on were listed. But in Victoria, the FF Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act came in 1999. And that was one of the first that specifically enabled the listing of invertebrate taxa. So, things have moved on a lot since then, obviously. But the book, the advocacy for inclusion of invertebrates in biodiversity considerations, conservation ecology, was really big back then. So, and what was interesting was there was an invertebrate conservation 20 years on from when the book came out. And what was really sad was all of the major issues around the limitations of conservation of biodiversity and invertebrates were pretty much the same. Wow. So limitations in taxonomy, skilling up of PhD students, the whole sort of standard, you know, the cute and cuddly, furry and feathered versus the invertebrates, and the attitude that bugs are bad sort of thing, you know, all those standard issues that were preventing you know, them getting a seat at the table in terms of being a focus for biodiversity or conservation ecology or conservation efforts was still the same 20 years on. So
it's interesting, during the recent bushfires of we had earlier this year, 2020, last year, 2019, people were mentioning invertebrates in sort of losses of billions of invertebrates and things. So that they're on people's radar.
They are now, but they weren't back then. No, they just weren't. So
but do you think though that people are really taking that seriously now?
I think so. I think there's been a general shift from species orientated to ecosystem function, and landscape ecology, and bigger scale, more comprehensive or integrated holistic approach to conservation and biodiversity management as a whole, I think. So,
but do we know, I mean, do we know enough about sort of what they do and sort of their functional roles?
I think their functional roles are well known. It's the individual species that are well known in any one community or so on. So they cover the whole gambit of functional roles in that. So another reason why they're so successful is in terms of numbers of species.
I just wonder whether, like, if somebody came up and said, "Oh, look, we've just lost all these, whatever," even to the genus or family level, whether we'd go, "Oh, that means we've lost some
X, Y, and Z functions." Yeah. It's an interesting question. I think with some groups you would lose. Let me think that through. There's probably some groups associated with decomposition roles and things like that you may have lost from forest ecosystems and so on, as well as cute things like velvet worms that don't have the capacity to move very far, snails and the same sort of thing. So I think it's more the whole community and their combined functions that I think you would lose, some of which would be able to recolonise for those that have flight capabilities or if in their aquatic systems upstream sources. But it's a good question. Would decomposition break down that role? But then you've lost most of the litter component anyway in forest fires. So it's a good question. I hadn't thought about it. My naive, because coming from a sort of fish biology point of view mostly, is my naive view of macroinvertebrates is they have such sort of quick and short life cycles that they will recover quickly and they can bounce back in huge numbers, but that may not be the case in some cases. That may not be the case. No, some are quite long lived. Some of the giant cockroaches, for example, up north, they have quite long lifespans. Years.
Yes.
So, but some of the aquatic systems, the mayflies, some of those can live for a couple of years as well. And the adults they're a day or two. So
that's true. Yes. Yeah. No. I hadn't really thought about it.
There's exceptions to every rule.
Yeah. Okay, back to the museum. So you're writing this book. You wrote this book, and how'd that go?
That went really well. So, I mean, that's part of the reason I was able to start as a consultant. It was a national assessment, so it involved going around and talking to all the leading entomologists and invertebrate ecologists, non-marine, everywhere. That
would have been amazing.
The opportunity was massive.
Any standout people you talked to back then?
Yeah, the likes of Peter Cranston. We went to the ANIC, the Australian National Insect Collection, up to Brisbane. We pretty much hit all of the museums.
So Peter Cranston, chironomid expert.
Chironomid expert, yes. Yep. We keep in touch a little bit, not a lot because I've stopped doing field collections and so on. But a lot of people across the whole country that cross paths with them occasionally, sort of thing. So it was a really good opportunity to meet a lot of the players in the invertebrate world, sort of thing.
A good way of making contacts for a young and up and coming person.
Yeah. So that was a secondment for about 18 months, and then I was seconded from what was then the state Victorian Rural Water Corporation, which ultimately got I can't think of the word, but it evolved into a consulting company.
Corporatized or?
Corporatized is the word I was looking for, yes.
Yeah.
Water Ecoscience. So,
oh, yes,
and all of
yes.
that was, so all of that time was doing macroinvertebrate sampling in rivers across Victoria. So I've sampled, I think, 23 of the 26 basins in Victoria.
And was that for sort of indicator species or what do you call water quality sort of stuff? Was that?
It was the forerunner of Ausrivers. So,
okay. So tell us about. Well, had you come up with an index at that stage, or?
Yeah, it was the Victorian Index. So Bruce Chessman and Dave Robinson from the EPA had come up with the Signal Index. Right?
That's the beginning of Signal.
Yeah, that was around the beginning of Signal. So that came out just before I was working at the state.
Tell us what Signal stands for.
Signal stands for Signal Invertebrate Index for, it's based on upland conditions for, condition, basically. Using invertebrate groups, particularly mayflies, stoneflies, and trichopterans.
And for water quality? Mainly water quality. Yeah. So nothing about water, nothing about flow as such. But
not flow as such, although it has been extended its use to varying levels of success across rivers. It's part of the Ausrivers process, the Signal Index.
So was that a you call it improvement from the EPT, the Ephemeroptera, Percoptera, Trichoptera Index?
Yeah, so that's what it's number of families, number of species in families, that sort of stuff. So, but the Signal score was based originally on cool, fast-flowing upland streams, based in the Latrobe Valley. So that's where it was originally developed. But that then got incorporated and expanded on into the Ausrivers method.
Yep.
So the Victorian Biological Monitoring, what was it called? Monitoring River Health Initiative was the, so Peter Davies, Richard Norris, those guys were sort of involved with Leon Metzling at the EPA.
So Ausrivers developed from RivPACs, or was that?
RivPACs, the Victorian system, they all the jurisdictions had various assessment protocols that they then came together, and Ausrivers was.
So what is the point of making up all these different indices? Why not just stick with one? Because
they do now predominantly stick with one.
Okay.
So,
and that's Ausrivers?
Ausrivers, predominantly. Each jurisdiction likes to have their own methods, and if they invest in developing their methods, they like to stick with them. So Victoria has the Index of Stream Condition, the Index of Wetland Condition, WetMap and VEFMap, all around assessing environmental condition, health of rivers and streams, and now wetlands as well.
And are they? I mean, if the different jurisdictions use different indices, how do they compare them? How can you actually make comparisons?
In theory, they don't. In theory, you should be able to compare them, and that to some extent is what some protocols like IECA, the Integrated Ecosystem Condition Assessment Method, which is part of the Australian National Aquatic Ecosystem Toolkit, which was developed by the federal government.
So many bloody
I know, there's so many things. But this has a process of harmonising or standardising data from one assessment tool to so apples and apples talk to each other, and then you can take through and do analysis on it. So there are methods out there to do it now. There weren't when all these methods started, and it's like any project. It's a local objective, it's a local focus, and so they develop local means. And I think in the 80s and early 90s, there wasn't a lot of collaboration between the jurisdictions on how to do things. It was individual driven. So the likes of Richard, and Peter Davies, they started pulling people together and networks together.
This is Tasmanian Peter Davies.
Tasmanian Peter Davies, yeah. So, and I think that's a key element in all of this is there's a relatively small number of freshwater ecologists or freshwater scientists around. And so building up those networks, I think it started, well, from my perspective, it started a lot from the taxonomy workshops that were run at the MDFRC.
So tell us a bit about those workshops, because they were interesting. They've ceased now, as far as I know.
They have ceased now because they've done most of the groups and have got guidelines or keys to how to do.
Do you know how they started?
They started because we were doing sampling along the Murray. John Hawking started them, and then we restarted them when I was there as well. So it was because they were doing some multi-jurisdictional monitoring work. And New South Wales had a name or a numbering system, some sort of classification system for what a species, which was a different classification system in Victoria and different in South Australia. So if we're wanting to get these data sets to start talking to each other, then we want to get beyond having a number as the identifier. So it was to promote the taxonomy, to promote getting names on species and uniform approach to naming.
Because we in my classes at Charles Sturt University, we use those identification guides all the time when we're, and they're amazing. They're an amazing resource. I mean, I've even contributed one of them some years ago to the fish larvae, but they're an amazing resource. And the amount of work that went into them, and most of it, I think, sort of pro bono by the people who were doing the work. I mean, it's just, I don't know.
I assume so. I think their costs were covered coming to Albury to do the workshops and so on, but most taxonomists do it for a love of the job. They want to name things, they want to get it sorted out, so they invest their time in it. So even those that have retired are still now working in at the museum, like the likes of Ross Sinclair and so on, John Dee.
Yes.
Yeah, they never give up. I'm sure Phil Suter's doing the same thing too. So.
No, it's amazing. I remember seeing, being there a number of years when seeing attendees arrive, and an interesting bunch of people.
It was a really interesting time because I remember I was very early in my career, and I remember looking to all these people and going, oh my God, they know so much. How do they know so much? And I've just realised over time, it's just time. You learn that over time.
That's right.
Yeah. But,
and then having to teach other people how to recognise a species by the sort of left wing on the whatever.
How many hairs has it got on its front toe and things like that.
That's right.
So,
So where we're up to, you were at the museum, you did this book, you interviewed lots of people. How did you get on to doing a PhD? Because we haven't even got to your PhD yet, have we?
No, I guess the consulting in the commercial world didn't fit that well. I had been talking to Sam Lake about the option of doing a PhD. I'd always thought about doing it. Alan and a few others had tried to convince me to do a PhD early on the giant Gippsland earthworm, and I went, nah. So I didn't go down that pathway at that time.
You would become absolutely famous if you did that.
Well, someone else did it. Bev did. I know the person who did the PhD, and she's pretty well known for that species. But
you could get typecast very easily, couldn't you? On working.
You can. So I don't know. I guess I just wanted to work for a few more years, and wasn't quite ready to settle into doing more study at that point. And then my father passed, and so I was still working, and I sort of it was a really, talk about coincidence, I've had some really lucky breaks in my career. And this was one of the classics. Was I'd had an appointment to talk to Sam at Monash about the possibility of doing a PhD. And it happened to be the day I resigned from Water Ecoscience, which was a spur of the moment thing. And I walked into Sam's office, I think at about like 11 o'clock in the morning, and said, right, I've just resigned. I need to put in for a scholarship application. And Sam was really cool. He said, yep, okay, fine. And it happened to be the last day of scholarship applications.
Wow.
At the uni, just purely by luck.
Mm-hmm.
And by 4 o'clock, I got my application in because I'd walked into Sam's office with 2 project ideas and basically said, this is what I'm thinking, either of these. And he said, well, which one do you want to do? And I said, well, the wetland one, because no one's doing anything in that space. So, yeah, that's incredibly lucky.
So back in those days, how did you actually have to really, when you applied for a scholarship, did you actually have to say what you were going to do? Because certainly now you almost have to almost have written your thesis by the time you apply to do the PhD.
I'm pretty sure we did, because it can't have been too onerous because we got it done in like half a day. Mm-hmm. And it was based through a CRC top-up scholarship. So
this is a Cooperative Research Centre for Freshwater Ecology.
Yes, sorry. Yeah.
That's right. I'm just...
For those that don't know all the lingo, yeah. So, yeah, it was a Australian Postgraduate Award scholarship plus CRC for Freshwater Ecology top-up. So, yeah, you wouldn't believe how many times I divided 20,000 by 52.
So you went from a full-time paid job to a PhD scholarship, even though it was a top-up. I know it would have been a pretty big shock.
It was a big shock to the system, and hence why I did consulting work throughout my PhD. So
some of us, I went through pretty much. Well, I did a few things before, but didn't really know what money was, so it didn't matter. But for people I know who've worked for a while, it's a pretty big shock to have to.
It's a very big shock. So yeah, and it was right at the cusp before they started going to the 3-year only projects. So my PhD spanned 7 years.
Right.
So yeah.
Happy days.
It was a very big project. I looked at 16 wetlands in the West Wimmera. The basic question was, does the wetland classification system we use in Victoria represent the biota that's present? So I looked at 4 different ecosystem types, so freshwater meadows, shallow freshwater marshes, deep freshwater marshes, and permanent wetlands, 4 replicates of each type. And I sampled macroinvertebrates, plants, birds, and water quality. So to get and it was based around measuring biodiversity. So how much sampling effort do you need to do to get a representative picture of the true diversity at the site, and so on, because, you know, we were using all these rapid assessment techniques at the time that do 200 animals, being indicative of the whole community present in a
so the rapid assessment, so live picking.
So I did a pilot test that showed how much sampling effort I needed to get 80% of the diversity present, and that ended up being 6 1-minute sweeps per wetland. Okay. And I did it at 1, 3, and 5 months from filling. And for anyone that wants to work in wetlands in the future, be aware that they rarely fill at the same time. But mine actually did. So,
oh, really? Wow.
Oh, it was incredible. Like I said, I've just been lucky.
Yeah. What year was that? What year was that?
1996. So it was a wet.
Prior to the drought.
Yeah, prior to the drought. And I got a massive local event that filled all of my wetlands at the same time. So, which is really a significant thing, because the turnover of species is such that if they're not set and sampled at an equivalent time, they will be different. There's just no question. MDFRC in Albury had shown that with Ryan's 1 and Ryan's 2 billabongs, 500 metres apart, completely different. So, and that's basically what I found with my PhD too, was that all 4 wetlands in each of the 4 categories were significantly different at 1 and 3 months after filling. And within a category, they were significantly different at 1 month and 3 months as well.
So they're heading off in different directions.
Yeah, the diversity, the range of diversity was massive, and even with the permanent wetlands, which was a bit of a surprise.
Yeah.
So, and that's with a data set of 1.3 million species identified. Yeah. 1.3 individuals identified to species level.
Oh yes, I was going to say 1.5. That's
Got it back to front. Yeah.
I mean that's incredible. I mean I have a PhD student working on macroinvertebrates in floodplain, urban floodplain wetland at the moment, and I beggars belief the difference between almost adjacent wetlands.
Even within the one wetland, depending on the macro habitat, sort of vegetated, open water, edge of vegetation, all of those micro habitats rather, they'll support different species. And even what we would map as a single wetland may have a temporary wetland area that dries and out on an annual basis, but the main wetland still has water. The species in that temporary area will be different to the permanent.
And is that all about dispersal of adult stages into these places, looking for those characteristics by these?
It's a mixture of things. The regularity, inundation history, how often they do flood. Mm-hmm. Anything that has a drying phase is likely to support temporary wetland specialists, so things that require that drying period. And then it's connectivity at the landscape scale, so distance. The Wimmera wetlands are really interesting in that they're in old dune swales from the old inland sea, so they're not floodplain, they're all non-floodplain wetlands, but when there's a lot of water there will be northern flow, so between wetlands, so they do have a level of connectivity between them.
So what's the advantage of colonising or being in a temporary wetland for a macroinvertebrate? What's it all about?
Productivity and food resources. It's massive. It's the boom and bust type situation that we have in Australian ecosystems. So you see that in Lake Eyre and everything, on massive scale, when those systems get wet, they just have a lot of propagules in the soil, in the sediment, boom, then everything else comes in to feed off that.
So we tend to think of microinvertebrates having the egg bank and the seed bank from plants, of course. But what about macroinvertebrates? I mean, do they have desiccation resistant stages?
Yep.
What are they?
Most groups. Okay. Beetles, of course. Chironomids, you'll get a quite interesting progression of colonisation, I guess, or emergence happening. And you can almost tell at how far after inundation a wetland would be based on the species that are there. So
succession type.
Succession, yeah.
Okay.
So there's 3 or 4 different groups, and you're really stretching my memory here, but temporary wetland specialists that have different requirements for when they emerge. And
we know about the macro crustaceans like the shield shrimp, or they call, and the tadpole shrimp and all those kind of things. So, but they tend to come and go fairly quickly, don't they?
They do. They're very fast. So the one thing that's around early and hangs on are ostracods. So I hated ostracods. It was so many of them. Yeah.
I think it's, to me that's a particularly fascinating area, because you've got, in a floodplain, or in your case these swales, you've got in some cases so many wetlands, but pretty much they're all individuals. And I know that with the work that Russ Shiel and I think it was John Green. John Green. Yeah, and I think Daryl was involved with Daryl Nielsen and sampling 50 wetlands, billabongs around Albury, and finding that there were so many of them that, they're all differed, but there are only a few taxa of rotifers that I'm thinking of here that were common to all these billabongs.
Yeah, Russ and John Green found a lot of hidden endemicity in Australia's fauna. It was originally thought back in the 80s that a lot of the Australian fauna was cosmopolitan, but it's actually not. So Russ's work is just, you know, huge contribution to
it's that. Almost, I mean, when I Daryl Nielsen comes and talks to my students every year and gives those results, and they're as astounding as the first time I heard them. And every time he does it, I think, you know, we talk about rainforest trees, sort of individual trees. These are individual wetlands that have got their own unique fauna, and it's just astounding the diversity that's out there.
Yeah. It's one of the big things that have changed over the life of, you know, 30 odd years, is that rivers were very, very much the 70s and 80s and even into the early 90s. They were the focus. And then wetlands started to get a Guernsey, particularly floodplain wetlands, not so much non-floodplain wetlands, but recognition of that connectivity and essential lateral connectivity between the rivers and the floodplains and wetlands on floodplains. So, and obviously with basin plan and so on, that's become even more accepted. But yeah, there was a lot of, it was very river centric for a long time, and there's still elements of that around. But wetlands, they're amazing systems. So
no, I'm fascinated by them too. So you did your PhD. You sorted through millions of bugs, but you were consulting during that time as well. So you had this supplementary income and a backup, and something to go to at the end of your PhD. Because a lot of PhD students, and I'm talking to some of them mine at the moment, they're going, "What am I going to do with my life at the end of it?" But had you thought about that, or it was just the
totally. Yeah. I started my business 3 days after I handed in my PhD with a consulting job I already had lined up.
Right.
So I planned that out in terms of I'd made arrangements with the university to hire out space, an office and lab space at the time, because I was still doing lab work then.
So that was Water's Edge. That's where you started Water's Edge.
Well, the first year was just in 2003 to 2004 was with Monash.
Right.
So it was under Monash's flag and you know, all that sort of stuff. But after a year of considerable overheads through the Monash university system, I went to being an independent. I seconded a research assistant from the department to help me with the business. And then a month later, I broke my leg. And broke my leg and ankle, and that really changed everything.
It wasn't sampling?
No, it was nothing exciting at all. No, it was just falling down 3 little steps, and 3 years later, I can't work in rivers anymore.
Wow.
So, yeah, I can't walk up and down slopes and so on because I annoyed my ankle.
Because I had a motorbike accident about a week before I was supposed to start honours at Monash.
Yeah.
This is in 1983. And my first few weeks of doing honours was trying to force a leg that had stitches and bandages into a pair of waders and wander up and down a river, which doesn't work.
Yeah, no. I tried to do meetings and run. The day I broke it, I was supposed to be giving a talk to Jane Doolan's group on floodplain ecology and wetlands in the now Department of Environmental, Water, Land and Planning in Victoria, and they go, it's not like Rhonda not to turn up, but I was in the emergency room. So it's the things that you just can't plan. And but at that stage I had my own business. I had contracts in hand. I had to outsource a lot of that work because I couldn't do the 70 wetlands surveying of condition assessment that we were doing. So yeah, that had a really big impact for about 3 years. So that forced a shift in what I did and didn't bid for. So I moved away from doing a lot of macroinvertebrate work into the Ramsar space.
So was that in some ways, was that a good thing?
Massive, yeah. Okay. I don't regret it at all.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, so Yeah, they're just fortuitous
Sounds like your whole career
opportunities. I know,
has been
major events and
it's been
just
one, not mistake, but one
trauma after another.
falling into something. Yeah. Well, that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
No design, no real plan or design there.
No. Well, I think I did design. I knew I wanted to do consulting. I'd been in the research. I'd been through the university system. I liked working by myself. But on the flip side, I like teams as well. So a part of my success is that we build specific teams for the job, which is why we've been so successful.
So I was going to ask you what you're saying about, I mean, it's not something that I've really ever gravitated towards, or I've done some consulting. So what is about consulting is that you like so much?
I like the applied nature of it, very much the applied nature. Much more like, I love NHT training. So doing
NHT?
training, National Heritage Training or NRM training. But I don't like training in universities because a lot of the kids, they're not that interested, They're there, they're just going through the motions. But if you're doing training for catchment management authorities or landholder groups, they're there because they're interested, and you always learn something from them. So
it's our challenge. Our challenge as university lecturers is always to inspire our students to get excited, and we do. I mean, we do at times, but it's a very different gig than.
It's really different. I mean, you've got 100% engagement versus 70, 80%, and those 10 or 20% that aren't engaged just annoy you. Because you're thinking, why don't you get this? This is cool stuff, So Ramsar was a really big thing, and the whole business of consulting is about relationships and who you know. So advice for your PhD students is start talking to people and start making those connections.
And how do they start talking to people?
Well, for me, I just knocked on doors in terms of literally CSIRO, Arthur Rylah Institute, anywhere I thought I might be interested in working. I went round in my undergrad and started talking to people. Through my PhD, Sam was brilliant. He, every year, would make sure around Christmas that I would have some sort of consulting work so that I'd have some additional income over the year. He was really subtle about it.
So you could buy him a Christmas. So you could buy him a Christmas present. That's all.
No, not really. Just we only ever gave Christmas cards, but
he still sends me Christmas cards.
Yeah, same.
It's unbelievable. It's fantastic.
Look, I have just enormous admiration for Sam, for Richard. I've been really lucky with the people that I've worked with. Terry Hillman's in that group, and then Alan Yen as well.
Well, Sam, you'll be happy to know Sam has agreed to interview.
Well, that'll be interesting. I
might have to do a few. I think that's.
Yeah, I think you could. I mean, the number of stories that Sam could tell is just, I mean, it was just such an experience to be in his lab, and he'd just wander in and he'd be reading something in the literature and he'd just start espousing the latest ideas or raving around how bad this article was or whatever. And it was just such a learning environment. It was brilliant.
So having people like Sam and Alan and Richard, others around, I mean, I think most people I've talked to, including myself, I end up doing freshwater stuff because of Sam. There's often people that, if they're enthusiastic about something and it inspires you to well, if they love it, it must be good fun. So I'll go down that track. You already had some background, but you've been involved with a range of people before you came across Sam. So.
I mean, that's been why, well, that was the basis of why I was able to get work straight away. So I'd established relationships with the Catchment Management Authority in the Wimmera, where I did my PhD. I'd worked on secondment through the EPA, which was reconnecting with people I'd worked with through the State Water Labs. So yeah, it's pretty good when you get the head of a section ringing up and go, "Hey Rhonda, I hear you need some money. Do you want a job?" You know, it's just knowing people and having those really good relationships is just, it's essential.
Presumably doing a good job at what you do is fairly important too.
Yeah, you always, as a consultant, all the ones I work with, we always do that extra bit. You have to have your client happy at the end. It's not about doing what you want to do. If the client doesn't want that, you don't do it. The flip side of it is, you know, a couple of people that have come on board that I work with now, that when they first came into consultancy, they were concerned about selling out, you know, having to do what the client wants. And I said, no, you don't do that. You don't do the job. If you think it's got hairs on it, you just don't take it on. So,
and ultimately you don't do a client a service by just telling them what they want to hear rather than perhaps what is actually real.
Yeah. So that's part of it. So getting back to why I wanted to do it, it's the applied nature. You're educating, you're transferring and educating the client or the regional manager or the person responsible for looking after the wetlands or whatever around how you do it. So you're educating people and you're bringing them up to speed, and that's, you can see the benefits. We did a 3-year training program in 2005 to 2008. It was a national thing with some people, a range of people, where we did a collaboration with wetland centres and delivered training at wetland centres all across the country, and developed up 18 training modules, 2-day events where you do a mixture of classroom and outside activities and so on. And so many of the people that came through those training programs are now key managers in regional authorities across the country, sort of thing. So you feel like you're making a contribution to on-ground outcomes.
I can really see that. That's it's not something that in my work that I have a lot of. I contribute. I think hopefully to students coming through, but not in that way. Yeah, I can see that. That would be very satisfying.
And connecting the dots, it's really quite surprising. Like I think you said at the beginning that I've had a vast range or a wide range of topics that I've been involved in. And it's really interesting still how many departments and agencies, they're still not talking to each other. And when you've got a whole of basin thing like the Basin Plan, you need that interaction and that integration. And it's getting there, but it's a slow process.
Yeah. Oh.
And I find quite often, because of the range of jobs we've done, we have a broader understanding of how things fit together in the jigsaw puzzle sort of thing. So it's we're quite often able, oh, you should talk to that person, or you should talk to this, or these guys are doing this in South Australia, sort of thing. So it's good. It's connecting people with different sources of information, and you know, all with the intent of getting good outcomes for the environment.
Yeah, so. And following up from what you were just saying about these people who are sort of managers and things who were doing some of this training, my experience sort of 30 odd years ago was that there weren't many sort of trained biologists in a lot of those roles.
No.
And that you were often trying to explain things to maybe engineers, sometimes foresters, sometimes just career public servants, but things have changed a lot, haven't they?
Enormously, yeah. The level of technical capabilities within the regional agencies, even in the state agencies, is massively improved, because they have to now have that technical understanding to say whether or not the products that they're getting, either from consultants or within the department, meet the requirements. It's, some of them is a learning curve, and that's just natural for everyone, I guess. But yeah, I think that's improved enormously.
So better decisions being made now?
Yeah, more informed. It's an ongoing learning process. It's never going to be perfect, but it's certainly, the basin plan is the classic example, I guess. You know, everyone's looking at it in terms of, well, how far have we got? Has it been effective? You know, how influential has it been? And you got to put it in context that it's baby steps. We haven't been that many years into the process. And, you know, all of the programs are, you know, learning about the system and then building on those learnings, the whole adaptive management type approach. And I think there's been some massive gains, but there's still a long way to go. But it's just so much more positive in so many elements. So, yeah.
So you think more people are on board?
Yeah, definitely more people are on board. There's not as much interjurisdiction conflict around, or we're going to do it our way, we don't want to play with you guys. There was a lot of that in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, because they'd all been developing programs they're on a state basis. They didn't want to let go of those things. But it is now, because it's legislative requirement, everyone's got to play together, sort of thing. So
is that because of
it has improved.
So is that largely because of the authority? Yeah. Okay.
Water Act. Yeah.
And you don't think also? I mean, I suppose it's all part and parcel of some of the crises, I suppose, that we've gone through. Yeah. I mean, the Millennium Drought helped in many ways, didn't it? Sort of.
Well, our government, and you can keep this in, is reactive. It's not proactive in the environmental space. So it will always have a knee-jerk response to an environmental disaster, but if they put in the funding on a longer-term commitment to address a lot of these things, then we wouldn't be having as many of these issues. So
yeah, I heard a description by I think it was a virologist or something recently, saying that they go through these cycles of panic and neglect.
Totally.
We have a similar thing, I think, don't we?
Oh, it's completely the same. I mean, the outcomes from the Millennium Drought, there was a massive amount of work, particularly in South Australia, but elsewhere as well, that was done around the Coorong and the Lower Lakes, for example, and how you manage aquatic systems in drought. And, you know, there was key books have come out in that, Sam's book and so on have come out in that time. And
well, it helps, I suppose, to have things like acid sulfate soil sort of threatening the whole of the lower lakes sort of things.
Yeah, exactly. But, and an article, you know, 3.2 under the Ramsar Convention that, you know, we weren't meeting our obligations and so on. So all of those sorts of things, but it's sort of all the funding stopped. You know, we're out of drought now, it's no more problems. It doesn't work that way.
Because I remember in 2001, I think 2001, that Darren and I ran this drought symposium in Albury, and it was February 2001, and the Millennium Drought had been going for quite a few years, and we're in the thick of it, and it was actually raining while we were having the symposium, which was rather ironic. It kept going for some time afterwards, of course.
Yeah.
But it's really funny because you sort of sit there talking about drought, looking out the window, seeing rain, and the human brain just goes, well, maybe we shouldn't be worrying about it so much because
well, we were this close, I thought, after the bushfires, all the wrong reasons, but we had climate change on genuine discussion on climate change, and then we got COVID.
That's put that on the back burner for a while.
It has totally put it on the back burner, and it's going to put a lot of other environmental programs on the back burner as well. So
because of funding, or just because of priorities?
Funding, yeah, they'll have to try and recover money, and from the COVID package that they've been doing to keep people employed, and I think the next couple of years are going to be very tough. So no, that's my suspicion as well.
So we've been talking for an hour.
I know.
Well, that's all right. We can go for a bit longer. So looking at all these different things you've been involved with in your consulting, and quite a few sort of evaluations of programs and things, and I looking at all of them, I mean, it really is quite an impressive list. do you think we've made a lot of progress in our understanding of sort of how freshwater systems, rivers and floodplains especially, function in a way that we can sort of confidently manage them with all this funding that's come through and all the work that's been done? There's been a lot of work done. Do you think we're in a much better place? I mean, we've talked about the managers and the goodwills there.
Yeah, I think it's heading in the right direction. Function is still early days, I think, because really it's only starting to come into everyone's, day-to-day language or conversation in the last 5 years. Before we were assessing, for example, the Living Murray project, it had 4 themes: birds, veg, fish, and I've forgotten what the other one was, hydrology or something. Anyway, it had those birds, veg, fish. But when you look at it, and this is one of the jobs we did, when you break it down to what are the objectives and that, they're actually measuring and assessing function. But it wasn't labelled as that. And so people weren't recognising it as being anything other than birds, veg and fish, but it's about recruitment, it's about spawning, it's about, tree health and function, not tree health, but function aspects. So the recruitment and the refugia and a whole range of things are in there. But they're just worded, they're packaged differently. So I think things like productivity, nutrient cycling, all of those basic biophysical functions, we still have a fair way to go because they're just harder to do. They're more complex than understanding sort of biotic reactions and interactions and functions. So
it's interesting. When I go through a sort of potted history of river ecosystem sort of concepts and understanding with my students, my third year students, and I talk about Noel Hines' book, I think in 1970. I'm trying to think of when it
77, I think, was it?
Yeah, it was not that long ago. And then we got the river continuum concept 1980 and flood pulse at 1989, and I say it's a really young science that we're dealing with here. And so if you talk about Noel Hines' book as being one of the first really to bring a whole lot of disparate ideas and concepts together, it's not that long ago.
No. And I think ecosystem function in particular, and then the other one, again, talking basin plain language, is resilience. So, and resilience is going to be one of the big ones, I think, obviously, because we have to manage our systems in a shifting climate. So, and we haven't really ventured into that space well that I know of yet. There'll be research projects around it, but in terms of what can managers do to increase the resilience of their systems in a shifting landscape or a drying landscape or a wetter landscape, whatever it might be, depending on where they are, then I don't think we're there yet. So,
well, I'm glad you said that, because one of the questions I was going to ask you towards the end is, where do you think we're going to be going, or what are some of the priorities for the future? And it sounds like resilience is one of those things.
Resilience, I think, and actual, rather than just saying we're going to consider climate change, we're going to include it. And I think the other big shift is involvement with First Nations. And learning from First Nations, because they've got massive traditional ecological knowledge that we can learn from. Anyone that's lived on the site, on country, knows the system. It's the same with farmers. Anyone that's on the land and on these systems understands them. And there's a massive amount of information that we can gain through proper engagement, and not just engaged as people say they want to move from being engaged into being married, and actually being involved in the projects, So I think that's Brad Mogridge's, he's sick of being engaged, he wants to be married.
I've organised, I'm in the process of organising to interview Sue Jackson as part of this series
brilliant,
as well.
yeah.
So interested in that, the whole cultural water, and having dabbled in some stuff myself, it's a very interesting area, and as you say,
did that oral history stuff, didn't you?
I've done some of that stuff, and I'm currently writing a book on Murray cod at the moment, which having to go back into that stuff as well. And no, I also did some archaeological zooarchaeological
All right.
work
Yep.
with the Yorta Yorta nation around Barma. So that was really interesting. Yeah, so it's a fascinating area, and I'm sure, as you say, it's going to be lots more to be seen.
It is becoming more front and centre, but there's still a long way to go with it. So the fish native recovery strategy is a really good example in that First Nations were on the table in designing the strategy and partnership sort of type arrangements. Same with rec fishes as well. You know, citizen science comes into play as well. So I think there's a lot more. All right, that's another area. I think it'll move to a social ecological considerations. So including that cultural, be it Indigenous or European cultural aspects alongside the ecological environmental aspects as well. I think there'll be a much more emphasis on that. So ecosystem functions, services, I think ecosystem services is funny that it hasn't got its hasn't had its time in focus in Australia as yet. There's not been a lot of work done on that yet, but I think
terrestrially, I think more so probably than freshwater, maybe.
More so, probably, and I haven't been across what's happening in the terrestrial environment. So I'm thinking just in terms of freshwater.
Yeah, I'm thinking terrestrial environments with pollination and things. It seems to be. I know a few people working in the area. It seems to be quite a vibrant area, but I think pollination is a big part of that. But we don't have quite the same.
Yeah, but regulating and provisioning services, all of the human benefits out of that still is reliant on having good, healthy water.
True.
So the separation of, water use and environmental value is just false. You can't really have one without the other. So.
Well, I think for such a long time, people... I was in a situation some years ago where when people said, why should we worry about things like diversity in freshwater systems and apart, because all we need to do is have clean water that we have to pump out. And then when things like acid sulfate soil started to really turn up, that was for me a really big turning point in my life. If you don't manage a system well, then there's something that could last for a long time. And it's really serious. And then things like blackwater events really came to the fore. And then algal blooms, and it's just a litany of issues which go on.
Those sorts of situations are going to get worse if they don't do something to fix it. So I think there has been massive steps forward, but there still needs to be proactive rather than reactive funding for these things. So I think it's going to be a tough call for the next few years, but after that, I think it's a perennial hope that things will get better in that area. So look, we have raged around a whole lot of things, and it's been absolutely fascinating to see where you've got to now. And we probably missed so much, but we can't talk forever. But maybe we can talk again. So it's. I think we might finish. I put this on to you before we started recording that I wanted you to tell a relevant joke, or I ask you if you do know a joke that you can tell us about. I do know a joke. It's a very simple one. What did the fish say when it hit the wall?
I don't know. What did the fish say when it hit the wall?
Damn.
Oh, I knew it was a mistake.
Fantastic joke. I don't know jokes, but that one, I just love it. It's so simple and so true.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for talking. It's been
That's really okay.
And I'll never believe anything you say again about not having anything to talk about, because you've managed to just talk nonstop for...
I know. I'm a very good talker. That's probably how I get these jobs. So.
All right. Thanks, Rhonda.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for asking me.